Like and subscribe right now, or the spider will crawl on your face when you're sleeping. Many scientists and psychologists enter their fields of study to benefit humanity. They seek knowledge that will help them to treat illnesses, elucidate the cause of certain conditions, and advance public health through their experiments and steadfast efforts. However, it hasn't always been approached in the most effective manner. If you stick around, you'll learn about the most horrifying human experiments of all time. Number 1. Separating triplets. Perhaps this is the most unreal story to ever happen. At 6 months, these 3 triplets were separated and sent to different families, where they grew up without any knowledge that the others existed. The irony is that they attended the same university years later. This is where things began being a little creepy, because sometimes these triplets received kisses and recognition from people they didn't know, as they referred to them using different names. That's just how identical these guys were. What made them realize that they were more than one was when one of the triplets went home but was still seen in school by his close friends. They finally got to meet each other and were shocked to their core. No one ever knew they were triplets, not even their parents. When confronted by the doctors at the hospital where the triplets were born, they claimed it was a test to see if inherited behavior and manners are true. Surprisingly, it also came with their faces, because they all looked completely identical. I hope they sued the hell out of that hospital. Number 2. Third Reich medical experiments. Decades ago, the Third Reich had very different preferences about their specimens for experiments. In fact, they had very specific tastes for humans, kids to be exact. Under the direction of Dr. Joseph Mengele, the program used twins as unwilling medical subjects in experiments that subjected about 3,000 children to disease, disfigurement, and torture at Auschwitz, under the pretense of conducting research into illness, human endurance, and other nonsensical topics. The most cruel part is that whichever kid didn't fit the criteria for being a twin was immediately terminated without hesitation. During the big selections that took place at the camp's enormous train platform, twins were separated from the other detainees and taken to the lab to be experimented on. Mengele often used one twin as a control while subjecting the other to cruel experiments such as forced insemination, illness injections, amputations, and even execution. The ones that were done away with were dissected and examined, while the twins that survived were also put to the same fate and then examined. The main aim of these heartless experiments was to explain the discrimination they believed was required against groups of people who had undesirable genetic traits, including Jews, LGBTQ people, persons with disabilities, and others. However, in an ironic twist, the identical experiments that had contributed to the rise of the eugenics movement in the Third Reich would also be responsible for its closure. Number 3. Japan's Unit 731. The Japanese Unit 731 was perhaps the most terrifying thing that happened during the Second World War, and has remained unpunished to this day. The hotly fought China-Japan dispute over war crimes and war memory, as well as the global discussion on science and ethics, continue to center on Japan's Unit 731. Between 1933 and 1945, 731 and its affiliated units conducted human experimentation, including vivisection on Chinese and other victims of Manchukuo, and throughout China with a staff of more than 10,000 people, including many of Japan's greatest medical scientists. The tests examine the lethality of biological weapons, as well as the capacity of the human body to resist various diseases and adverse environmental factors like extreme cold. Along with conducting tests, Unit 731 also pioneered the use of biological weapons on multiple occasions during the conflict, with strikes on Ningbo and other cities in the Xinjiang province receiving the most attention. Unfortunately, casualty statistics are still up for debate, just like with the Comfort Ladies and the Nanjing Massacre. For the time period concluding in 1945, the claim of 3,000 people killed in Pingfan, the main experiment site of the Ishi network, is universally acknowledged among experts. Accurate casualty figures are challenging due to the Japanese authorities' post-surrender destruction of research sites and military documentation. Number 4. The Monster Study. What would you think if a scientist told you that you can cure your disability with a little hard work? I know I'd be in denial, but I'd want to change it, however long it took. Dr. Wendell Johnson, a speech therapist, performed the Monster Study to find out more about how and why children stammer. Johnson created the Monster Project to determine whether stuttering was the consequence of learned behavior or biology. But the study had several ethical issues. 22 orphans were selected by Johnson to participate in the Monster Study, without really knowing what was going to be asked of them. A few of the orphans stammered. Some of the orphans weren't stammerers. The orphans were divided into 2 groups, each including both stutterers and non-stutterers. Normal speakers was the name given to one of these groups. The rest were referred to as stutterers. Afterwards, the children received this treatment throughout the entire experiment. The praise from the researchers had no effect on the kids who were classified as normal. They only noticed improvements in one child. The stuttering group of kids did far worse. Keep in mind that not all of these kids truly stammer. Some were merely told they did. 5 of the 6 kids were erroneously reprimanded for their speech issues. According to reports, some of these kids stopped speaking altogether and others withdrew socially. These kids are as young as 5 years old. It's so unfair that Dr. Wendell Johnson was able to treat those kids like that. Number 5. Burke and Hare. Burke and Hare are 2 of Scotland's infamous serial killers, believed to have taken down at least 16 people. They're known for body snatching in addition to Terminator tendencies. According to research, they used to sell them to Dr. Knox, who dissected them at his anatomy school in Surgeon Square, Edinburgh. Little is known about the pair's genuine personalities, because there isn't much archival information that has remained. Numerous amateur sleuths and crime historians have taken an interest into the pair. The terrifying truth about Burke and Hare's story is how they disposed of their victims right after suffocating them. Because they sold their murder victims to anatomy schools, they earned the nickname body snatchers. They never stole a body from a grave, according to the evidence. Pretty cruel, don't you think? Regardless of it all, it still doesn't justify the fact that the whole thing is very inhuman. Number 6. Surgical experiments on slaves. Dr. James Marion Sims is regarded as the father of modern gynecology. Sims also created cutting-edge surgical methods and reproductive health-related equipment. He was elected president of the American Medical Association in 1876. And the American Gynecological Society, a group he helped form, elected him to that position in 1880. A dozen sculptures honoring the physician from the 19th century are located all around the nation. As much as he did all this to help mankind, it's wrong to say that the end justifies the means. It never does. Sims had made a deliberate effort to help women, but through experimenting on African enslaved women. This is clearly not okay. In fact, many medical ethicists, historians, and others argue that Sims' use of enslaved black bodies as medical test subjects falls into a long, ethically deficient history that also includes the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and Henrietta Lacks, because the research was carried out on black slave women without anesthesia. Sims has been criticized for caring more about the tests than about treating patients therapeutically, and for operating under the discriminatory assumption that black people don't experience pain. What a psycho. Number 7. Guatemala Syphilis Study. For about 2 years, over 5,000 ignorant and unconsented Guatemalans were purposefully infected with bacteria that cause sexually transmitted illnesses as part of research trials conducted by the United States government, in an immoral, unethical, and possibly criminal manner. Even now, many continue to go untreated, which is shocking. In fact, some of the doctors who conducted the tests didn't even know that they were infecting people with syphilis. All they kept insisting was that they were treating it. So some U.S. government researchers knew they were breaking ethical guidelines when they injected Guatemalans with syphilis and gonorrhea for a study. In order to explore the effects of penicillin, Doctors infected hundreds of psychiatric patients, sex workers, and criminals in the 1940s. None of the Guatemalans were notified. This is so sad and absolutely disgusting. Number 8. The Tuskegee Experiment. In 1932, 600 black men from Tuskegee were called in to be treated for their bad blood, a term used to describe anemia and other related blood issues. However, that wasn't the entire plan of these American scientists. The guys received free medical examinations, free meals, and funeral insurance in return for their participation in the study. Little did they know they were being experimented on like guinea pigs. Given how difficult life was for blacks back then, it's only natural that they volunteered for the program, and they trusted their government, something people don't do anymore, and rightfully so. The truth is that the study was done to understand the history of syphilis. What was unethical about this study is the fact that despite researchers' knowledge that 399 people on the program already had syphilis, they did nothing to treat them. Even when it was discovered that penicillin could treat syphilis, the researchers knowingly withheld treatment with the sole goal of seeing how it would turn out if they weren't treated. To date, this still remains one of the biggest travesties in the American medical industry. Number 9. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Zimbardo and his colleagues wanted to know whether the violence that had been observed among prison guards in American jails was more likely a result of officers' sadistic dispositions or more likely a result of the prison environment in 1973. In order to get to the bottom of this, 24 volunteers were found, 12 prisoners and 12 guards. They were all supposed to spend the next 2 weeks in the basement of Stanford University, which had somehow been transformed into a correctional facility. Within the first 6 days, life in the basement was hell, and all the prisoners wanted was to get out of there. At the assumed correctional facility, they were stripped naked and deloused. There was food rationing and controlled use of the washroom, and they were forced to dress like prisoners and be addressed by the tags on their clothes. News of this disgusting brutality made the national headlines as soon as it got out. Number 10. Prison inmates as test subjects. For a small fee, black prisoners during this time were utilized as test subjects in a variety of medical studies. The Holmesburg prison served as the setting for contentious long-running studies using biochemical, pharmacological, and dermatological weapons on prisoners. Soon, ethical guidelines that are applied in modern research were impacted by tests and studies done on inmates. Regardless, they had no right to use humans as lab rats. The saddest thing is that it was all for nothing, because they didn't even finish what they started. Until next time, adios.